In the last section, we redeployed our campaign factory contract. Note that we only changed code inside of our campaign, but we wanted to make sure that we were no longer using any old versions of our campaign. So we just decided to redeploy both contracts. So we're now going to be working with a completely new instance of the factory, and this new factory will have absolutely no campaigns associated with it. Let's make sure that we do update the address of our new factory. So here's our contract was deployed to, here's the address. I'm going to copy this thing, and we're going to make sure that we update our factory.js file to reflect the new root address for our factory. So back inside my code editor, I'm going to find my Ethereum factory.js file, and I'm going to replace the existing address in here with the new one that we just deployed to. So here's the new address. This is the one that we actually care about now. I'll then save this file, and let's restart our server and make sure that we can still work with this factory inside of our project. So back over at the terminal, to restart my server, I'm going to change back to my Kickstart directory, and then inside of here, we'll run npm run dev, like so. Now, every time that we add an additional library to our project, it takes slightly longer for our project to actually boot back up. So it might take a couple seconds for everything here to get processed and eventually get some content on the screen. So I'm just going to give it a second to kind of warm up. I'm going to flip back over to my application. Now you might still see some of your old campaigns on the screen. Do make sure that you refresh the page entirely. So I'm going to do a hard reload here back at localhost 3000. And when I do so, I should see an empty list of campaigns appear because we now have a completely new factory with absolutely no campaigns tied to it whatsoever. Of course, we need to have at least one campaign to work with inside of our contract so we can actually develop the show page. So let's go back to our create campaign form, and I'll give it just a second to load up. There we go. And we'll create a new campaign instance. I'll enter in my minimum contribution of 100, and I'll click create. And then of course, we'll wait for the actual transaction to be processed. Okay, so while that's going, let's flip back over to our code editor, and we're going to start working on the campaign show component. All right, I'm going to first pull up the campaign show component itself. So here it is right here. So inside this thing, we now want to somehow get a handle on the campaign that we're trying to look at and somehow call that get summary function on it that we just added 2 seconds ago. So remember, anytime that we want to fetch some data about a given campaign or anything inside of one of these page components, we're going to define that GetInitialProps method. That function gets called automatically before our campaign gets rendered or before our component is rendered to the screen. We already defined this function one time back inside of our index.js file. So here's the index.js file. Here's where we had defined getInitialProps. We fetched some initial information and then returned that as an object, and we then got access to it on our props object inside the component. So we're now going to do the exact same thing inside of our campaign show component as well. So back over here, at the top of the component, I'll define static async get initial props. Now there is going to be one distinct difference between the code that we had written previously inside of getInitialProps and what we have to do now. So this time around, we are trying to show information about one very particular campaign on the screen. And the campaign that we actually care about is going to have its address in the URL bar or in the address bar of our browser. Now remember, we just went through all of that rigmarole and all that complexity inside the routes.js file to set up the ability to capture that token inside the URL. So our routes file right here is going to parse the URL, and it's going to look for that wildcard, which it's going to call the address property or the address parameter, because we specifically called this thing address right here. So because we did all this route stuff right here, our getInitialProps function right here is going to be called with a props object of its own. So this is a separate props object than the one that ends up inside of our actual component instance. This props object has a property called query. And one property on this query thing right here is that token out of the URL that we asked our routing library for. And it's available as address, like so. So props.query.address, this thing right here is the actual address of the campaign that we're trying to show to our user on this page or in this component. Just to make sure that this thing is working the way we expect, let's add a console log for it right here and just make sure that, hey, can we actually see the address of the component or the campaign that we care about? So I'm just going to console log it, and let's try to test this out in the browser. So I'm going to go back over to the browser. You'll notice that we've now got the campaign that we just created on the screen. I'll click on View Campaign, and we're going to give it just a minute to finish building that page. Okay, my mistake. We just added in that console log, and we actually have to return an object from that thing. So let's make sure that from GetInitialProps, we at least return an empty object. That's just to get that function to work the way that next expects. So now if we flip back over and wait for the reload, all right, there we go. And so now, okay, you're not quite seeing the console log on the screen just yet. There's some very particular reasons for this, but basically remember all this Next.js stuff is all about server-side rendering. If I go over to my terminal, you will see the console log over here. To get the console log in the browser, we can actually go to any other page and then navigate back to this one right here. So if I now go back to View Campaign, you'll see that address appear right here as the console log. Again, we didn't initially see it inside the console right here, just because of the way all this server-side rendering stuff works. We'll talk more about when GetInitialProps actually gets executed inside the browser later on, but for right now, we should at least be able to see the address inside the browser. And it looks like we are. So this is the address of the actual campaign instance that we're trying to read some information about. So now that we have this address right here, let's write some code in the next section to attempt to actually get access to the campaign that exists there and call the getSummary function on it, and then show that information inside the component. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute.